Picture this. It's the year 1350. You're standing in the streets of Dadu, the magnificent capital of the Mongol Empire, the city we now call Beijing. You watch a merchant push a wheelbarrow piled high with paper money toward the marketplace. Not a bag of money, a wheelbarrow full. The vendor doesn't even look up. He laughs. He waves the merchant away like he's offering garbage. That wheelbarrow of cash won't buy a single sack of rice. We think the Mongols fell because they were conquered. We imagine armies sweeping in, defeating the horsemen who had conquered the known world. That's the story we tell ourselves. But here's the truth. The Mongols weren't beaten by swords. They were beaten by accountants. They weren't defeated by generals. They were defeated by their own printing press. The largest land empire in human history didn't collapse because they lost a war. It collapsed because they went bankrupt. This is a story about the ledger, about what happens when an empire discovers it can create money from nothing, and about the brutal, inevitable mathematics of economic collapse. Because you can print currency, but you cannot print value. And when a government forgets that distinction, nations burn. Let's go back to when they had it all. The year is 1279. Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis, has just unified all of China under Mongol rule. The Yuan Dynasty is born, and it is glorious. Imagine standing in the capital. The palace complex stretches for miles. Gold leaf glitters on every surface. Silk banners the size of buildings ripple in the wind. The treasury vaults are stacked floor to ceiling with silver ingots. The granaries hold enough grain to feed millions for years. This isn't just an empire. It's an economic superpower. The Mongols control the entire Silk Road from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. Every caravan that moves, they tax. Every trade deal made, they take their cut. Persian mathematicians work in their courts. Chinese engineers build their siege weapons. Italian merchants line up to do business. Marco Polo himself serves in the Khan's administration, documenting the wealth that seems to have no limit. But here's what most people miss. The Mongols were nomadic warriors. They grew up on horseback, not in counting houses. They understood conquest. They understood logistics. But they didn't fully understand finance. And that gap in knowledge was about to become a fatal wound. Beneath all that gold and glory there was a problem growing. A problem that would eventually strangle the entire empire. China's economy was exploding. Trade was booming. Markets were expanding in every direction, and they were running out of money. Not wealth, money. Actual physical coins. You can't just mine copper and silver fast enough when your economy doubles in size. Merchants were hauling around literal tons of metal coins just to do business. The weight alone made large transactions impossible. So Kublai's advisors came to him with a revolutionary idea. Why use metal at all? Why not use paper? China had experimented with paper currency before during the Song dynasty. But what Kublai created was different. It was the world's first true fiat currency. Money backed by nothing except the word of the emperor. They called it the Chao. It was made from mulberry bark, stamped with the Khan's red seal. And it carried a simple warning printed in the corner. Counterfeiters will be decapitated. At first, it was genius, pure genius. The government could pay its soldiers without mining copper. Merchants could carry fortunes in their pockets instead of on pack animals. The velocity of trade increased overnight. Money flowed faster. Deals happened quicker. The economy roared. Marco Polo was stunned. He wrote that the Khan had mastered alchemy, turning worthless bark into gold. For about 2 decades it seemed like they'd found the secret to infinite prosperity. But here's the thing about fiat currency. It only works as long as people trust it. Trust is the foundation. Trust is everything. And trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. The Mongols were about to learn this lesson in the most brutal way possible. The addiction started slowly. Kublai Khan looked across the sea at Japan. He wanted it. He needed it. His ego demanded it. So in 1274, he ordered an invasion. This wasn't a small operation. He commissioned the construction of thousands of ships. He mobilized tens of thousands of soldiers. He hired sailors, bought supplies, forged weapons. The cost was astronomical. And how did he pay for it? He printed money. Millions of Chao notes rolled off the presses. The fleet sailed. It was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. And then nature intervened. A massive typhoon, the kamikaze, the divine wind, smashed the fleet to pieces. An entire army drowned. Billions in resources sank to the bottom of the sea. The wood, the iron, the grain, the labor, all gone. But here's the critical part. The paper money that paid for it, that was still circulating in China. Every single note. Think about what that means. The real wealth had been destroyed, but the claims on that wealth still existed. You now had the same amount of money chasing fewer goods. Prices had to rise. It's not a theory, it's mathematics. But Kublai didn't see it that way. He saw a military failure, not an economic disaster. So he did what any emperor with a printing press would do. He tried again. In 1281, he launched an even bigger invasion of Japan. More ships, more soldiers, more supplies, more printed money. And another typhoon destroyed this fleet, too. Another fortune at the bottom of the ocean. Another wave of paper money flooding the markets. The pattern was set. The addiction had taken hold. Every time the empire faced a problem, the solution was the same. Print more money. Kublai didn't stop with Japan. He invaded Java. It failed. He launched multiple campaigns into Vietnam. They all failed. Each failure drained real resources from the economy. But the debt, in the form of paper currency, kept growing. The gap between the paper promises and the actual wealth backing those promises was widening into a chasm. And the court, living in their bubble of luxury, didn't see it coming. After Kublai died in 1294, things got worse. His successors lacked his authority and his discipline. The Yuan court became bloated beyond belief. Thousands of officials on the payroll. Lavish palaces that cost fortunes to maintain. And worst of all, they had to keep the Mongol princes on the steppes happy. These traditional nobles weren't interested in governing. They wanted cash, they wanted gifts, they wanted bribes, and the court paid them constantly. The finance ministers became criminals. Men like Ahmed Fanakati turned the treasury into their personal bank account. They created state monopolies on salt and iron, then sold licenses to their cronies. They confiscated property from successful merchants on made-up charges. They looted the provinces. And when the tax revenue wasn't enough, they had a simple solution. Print more money. By the 1340s, the situation was spiraling out of control. The government tried to hide the problem with a classic move. Currency reform. In 1287, they issued new Chao notes. One new note was worth 5 old notes. Read that again. Overnight, the government told everyone their savings were now worth 20% of what they had been yesterday. It was theft, sanctioned by the state. The people watched their life's work evaporate. Inflation hit like a plague. Prices doubled, then doubled again, then doubled again. A bag of rice that cost 1 chow in the morning cost 3 by evening. Wages couldn't keep up. Fixed incomes became worthless. The common people, the farmers and laborers, were being crushed, and they knew exactly who was responsible. The foreign Mongol rulers who had turned their currency into confetti. Merchants stopped accepting paper money. Why would you trade silk or spices for notes that would be worth half as much tomorrow? Shopkeepers closed their doors. People started hoarding silver and copper, burying it in their homes. The sophisticated trade network that had made the Mongol Empire rich ground to a halt. The Silk Road, that golden highway of commerce, became a graveyard. Nobody knew what anything was worth anymore. The social contract was breaking down. Fiat currency only works because of collective belief. The moment the population stops believing, the system collapses, and belief was dying fast. People looked at the paper in their hands and saw it for what it was. Worthless bark with a broken promise stamped on it. The emperor's word meant nothing anymore. Then came the coup de grace, the Black Death. The plague arrived in China around 1331, traveling along the very trade routes the Mongols had built. It killed between 30 and 60% of the population in some regions. Think about that scale. 1 out of every 2 people. Gone, villages were wiped off the map. Cities became morgues. The social order collapsed into chaos. Agriculture failed completely. There was nobody left to plant crops, nobody to harvest wheat. Famine followed disease, and the government's tax base simply evaporated. You can't collect taxes from corpses, but the emperor still had bills to pay. The army still needed food. Officials still demanded their salaries. So the government did the only thing it knew how to do. It printed more money. This is where the story becomes almost surreal. The economy was dying, the currency was worthless, and the government's response was to enforce its use even more strictly. They issued decrees making it a crime to refuse paper money. They sent soldiers to compel merchants to accept it. But you can't enforce laws when your soldiers are dying of plague. The state was losing its monopoly on violence, its ability to govern at all. The people had nothing left to lose. They'd watched hyperinflation steal their savings. They'd watched the plague kill their families. And they'd watched the Mongol elite, safe in their palaces, do nothing. Anger turned to rage. Rage turned to rebellion. A Buddhist sect called the Red Turbans rose up. Their leader was Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant orphan whose entire family had died of famine and disease. He had no education, no noble blood, but he had something more powerful. He had millions of desperate people who wanted revenge. The Red Turbans didn't just want to change the government. They wanted to erase it, burn it down, start over. And when they captured a city, the first thing they did was symbolic. They went to the government offices and burned the tax records. They burned the official documents, and they made huge bonfires of the worthless paper money. The Mongol army, unpaid and starving, barely fought back. They were a shadow of the force that had conquered the world. Many soldiers simply deserted. taking their weapons and going home. The empire was collapsing from within. By 1368, it was over. The last Yuan emperor fled Beijing without a fight. He retreated to the Mongolian steppes, where his ancestors had started their journey a century before. The circle was complete. Zhu Yuanzhang became the Hongjiu emperor, founding the Ming Dynasty. And one of his very first acts tells you everything you need to know. He completely abolished paper money, banned it. The trauma of hyperinflation was so deep, so painful, that China would not trust paper currency again for nearly 500 years. They went back to silver and bronze coins. Physical money you could hold, money that couldn't be printed into worthlessness. The Ming Dynasty also did something else. They turned inward. They closed China's borders. They restricted foreign trade. They rebuilt the Great Wall to keep the outside world out. The era of the Silk Road, of global trade, of cultural exchange, was over. The Mongol experiment had failed so catastrophically that it poisoned the well for generations. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because numbers tell the real story. At its peak, the Yuan dynasty's economy was worth an estimated 400 million taels of silver. That's roughly $100 billion in modern terms. By 1368, the paper currency was so worthless that people literally used it as kindling to start fires. The wealth hadn't disappeared. The trust had. And without trust, the economic machine simply stopped. The legacy of this collapse echoed for centuries. China's suspicion of paper money lasted until the Communist Revolution. Even today, Chinese economic policy is heavily influenced by the memory of hyperinflation. The yuan is carefully managed. The government maintains massive foreign currency reserves. They learned the lesson that the Mongols didn't. Sovereignty is solvency. Here's the brutal truth that applies to every empire in history. You can print infinite money. You cannot print infinite value. The Mongols thought they discovered a cheat code. Free money whenever they needed it. But economics doesn't care about military power. It doesn't care about vast armies or impressive palaces. The ledger always balances. And when you create money faster than you create wealth, the correction is violent and inevitable. The Mongol Empire, at its height, controlled more land than any empire before or since. They revolutionized warfare, administration, and trade. They connected East and West in ways that had never been done, but they made one fatal mistake. They confused currency with wealth. They thought paper could replace gold. They thought promises could replace reality. And that mistake destroyed them more thoroughly than any army ever could. Genghis Khan conquered the world on horseback. His grandsons lost it with a printing press. The barbarian hordes that terrified Europe, that toppled dynasties and razed cities, were ultimately defeated by inflation. Not by generals, by accountants. The balance sheet won. It always does. This isn't ancient history. It's a warning. Every government that's ever had a printing press has faced the same temptation. Solve every problem with new money. Pay every debt with paper. The Mongols did it. The Weimar Republic did it. Zimbabwe did it. Venezuela did it. The pattern is always the same. And the ending is always the same. Hyperinflation, collapse, suffering. The lesson is simple but hard to accept. Money is not wealth. It's a claim on wealth. And when you issue more claims than there is wealth to back them, those claims become worthless. It doesn't matter if you're the most powerful empire on earth. The mathematics don't care. The ledger always balances. And when it does, empires fall. So the next time you hear about a government printing money to solve its problems, remember the Mongols. Remember Kublai Khan and his brilliant paper currency. Remember the wheelbarrows full of worthless cash. Remember that beneath every political crisis, every military defeat, every revolution, there's usually an accountant quietly closing the books. Because in the end, history isn't written by kings. It's written by the people who control the money. If you want to stay ahead of the economic patterns that shape our world, hit that subscribe button. Most people learn about history after it repeats. You don't have to be one of them. The ledger is always watching, and the ledger always wins.